The first rule of the Black Meridian auction was simple. Prisoners were allowed to breathe, but not to bid. Jonah Reed learned that rule with his wrists locked in cold iron and his knees aching against the stone floor, somewhere 300 feet beneath the Nevada desert, in a hall that looked too rich to exist under a prison convoy route. 12 hours earlier, he had been inmate number 4172, a former search and rescue pilot, serving time for a crash he still swore was not his fault. Now he was property in a room full of velvet masks, pale faces, black suits, and candles that burned red without smoke. The guards had told him to keep his head down. That was easy enough at first. Jonah had spent 6 months learning how to disappear inside concrete walls, how to answer only when spoken to, how to make himself smaller than the men who enjoyed reminding him he had lost everything. But the auction hall made silence feel different. It was not prison silence. It was marketplace silence, the kind that weighed people, sorted them, and waited for someone to name a price. Above him, on a raised obsidian platform, a silver-haired auctioneer sold relics, cursed maps, blood-sealed contracts, and things hidden under velvet cloths. Around Jonah, other prisoners knelt in a guarded row, human, alien, and things that only looked human until the light hit their eyes wrong. He kept his breathing steady and his gaze on the floor until a sound moved through the hall that made every bidder go still. Chains. Not the rough iron chains on Jonah's wrists, but something heavier, cleaner, and colder, dragged across stone with the slow rhythm of a storm coming down a hallway. The auctioneer stopped smiling. The masked nobles stopped whispering. Even the guards behind Jonah shifted their weight, like men suddenly remembering they had families. A prisoner beside him, an old smuggler with silver tattoos on his neck, leaned close enough to whisper, "Do not look at her." Jonah's eyes stayed down. Who? The huntress. The word passed through the prisoner row like a draft under a locked door. Jonah had heard stories in prison about vampire huntresses, women bred by old blood courts to track. Monsters worse than themselves, killers of rogue clans, oath breakers, and kings who forgot the limits of power. But stories were safe because they stayed outside the bars. This one arrived behind the curtain at the far end of the stage, escorted by 12 guards in white armor. A black iron frame rolled into view, covered in a dark cloth stitched with silver warning marks. The air dropped 10 degrees. Jonah saw his own breath fog in front of him. The auctioneer lifted one hand and spoke more softly than before. Final lot. No names. No direct address. No challenge gestures. Bidding will begin only after the restraints are verified. The cloth fell. Jonah looked up before he could stop himself. She stood chained inside the frame, tall, pale, and terrifyingly still, with long black hair tangled around a face too sharp and proud to belong to a victim. Her eyes were crimson, but not wild. Focused. Angry. Awake. A dark hunter's coat hung torn around her shoulders. Silver restraints crossed her wrists and throat, and yet every noble in the room looked smaller than she did. The auctioneer called her an asset. Someone in the front row flinched. The old smuggler whispered, "That is Mara Vane. Nobody with a future will bid on her." Jonah watched her scan the hall, not pleading, not begging, simply measuring every coward who had come to see what fear looked like in chains. Then her gaze reached the prisoner row and stopped on him. For 1 second, Jonah forgot the iron on his wrists, the prison number on his shirt, and the fact that he owned nothing in the world except the breath in his lungs. Mara Vane looked at him as if she recognized a man who had been buried before death and had not agreed to stay there. The auctioneer opened the bidding. No one moved. The price fell once, twice. Still no hands rose. A bidder laughed nervously and said she was too dangerous to own. Jonah looked at the chain marks at her wrists, remembered the burning aircraft, the passengers he had dragged through smoke while officials later called him reckless, and felt something in his chest turn from fear into refusal. The auctioneer lifted his hammer to close the lot. Jonah raised his shackled hand. Jonah Reed's shackled hand rose only 6 inches before the entire Black Meridian auction turned toward him. The movement should have been too small to matter. He had no bidder paddle, no account, no invitation, no legal name inside that room beyond the number sewn onto his prison shirt. But sometimes a small act becomes loud because every powerful person nearby has agreed not to do it. The auctioneer froze with his hammer halfway raised. The 12 white-armored guards around Mara Vane tightened their formation. A low murmur moved through the masked nobles. Not laughter, not outrage, but the kind of disbelief that comes when the lowest man in the room violates a rule the highest people were too afraid to touch. The old smuggler beside Jonah whispered, "Put your hand down unless you want to be remembered for 5 more seconds." Jonah kept it up. His shoulder burned. The iron around his wrists pulled against his skin. Mara's crimson eyes stayed fixed on him, and for the first time since she had been brought out, something changed in her expression. Not hope. Hope would have been too easy. It was recognition, cautious and sharp, as if she had seen men pretend to be brave before and was waiting for the lie to collapse. The auctioneer lowered his hammer with careful precision. "Prisoners do not participate in the exchange." Jonah's voice came out dry from hours without water. "Then why bring us where we can hear prices?" A ripple passed through the room. Somewhere in the balcony, a woman in a gold mask laughed once, then stopped when no one joined her. The auctioneer's smile returned, thin and offended. "You misunderstand your place." Jonah looked at Mara's chains, then at the faces avoiding her eyes. "That seems to be happening a lot tonight." A guard stepped behind him and gripped his shoulder hard enough to make his knees press deeper into the stone. Jonah did not fight him. He had learned in prison that struggling was often just another language people in power were waiting to punish. Instead, he kept his hand raised as much as the shackles allowed. On the stage, Mara spoke for the first time. Her voice was low, controlled, and colder than the air around her. "Do not spend your last ounce of defiance on me, human." The guard nearest her snapped, "Silence." Mara turned her head slightly, and the guard went quiet without knowing he had obeyed. Jonah felt every hair on his arms rise. She was bound, surrounded, and still the room bent around her. "I am not spending it," Jonah said. "I am using it." The auctioneer struck his cane against the floor. "This disruption is over." From the front row, a tall vampire noble in a silver half-mask stood slowly. The reaction was immediate. Bidders lowered their heads. Guards straightened. Even the auctioneer stepped back half a pace. The noble removed one glove finger by finger, as if time itself belonged to him. "Let the prisoner speak," he said. "I want to hear what a man with nothing believes he can offer." The old smuggler beside Jonah went pale. "That is Lord Cashin Rook," he breathed. "He funded half the convoy prisons in the Western Territories." Jonah looked at Rook and felt the cold settle into a more familiar shape. Men like him had signed reports, approved transfers, stamped liability waivers, and used clean language to bury dirty choices. Rook smiled down at him. "Your name?" "Prisoner." "Jonah Reed." "Conviction?" Jonah hesitated. The auction hall waited. "Criminal negligence in an aerial rescue crash." Rook's smile widened. "A failed rescuer." How fitting. The words hit exactly where they were aimed. Jonah saw the aircraft again, not in flames, not as the court had described it, but in fragments of memory. Alarms, desert wind, passengers crying in the smoke, his hands dragging a boy through a broken emergency hatch while the second engine screamed. He had saved 12 people. The crash board had blamed him for the one passenger they said his unauthorized maneuver failed to protect. Nobody cared that the flight recorder disappeared before trial. Nobody cared that the private security company operating the route belonged to a shell corporation tied to men like Rook. Mara watched him through the silence, and her expression sharpened as if she had heard more than he said. The auctioneer lifted a ledger. "Mara Vane, stripped huntress of the Nocturne Writ, is currently priced at $10,000 due to lack of qualifying bids. You have no money, no property, and no recognized freedom. Your raised hand has no value." Jonah looked down at the chain between his wrists. "Then put my sentence against it." The room went still in a new way. The auctioneer blinked. Rook's smile disappeared. Mara's chains gave a soft metallic sound as her hands flexed. The old smuggler whispered, "You fool. Prisoners' stake is older than their courts." Jonah kept his eyes on the auctioneer. "I have 14 years left. Sell that." The red candles dimmed all at once. Beneath Jonah's knees, a thin line of blue light appeared in the stone, curling around him like a question. The auctioneer's ledger opened by itself, pages flipping fast enough to stir the cold air. Rook stepped forward. "Do not accept that bid." The auctioneer's face had gone gray. "It is not a bid." Mara's voice cut across the stage. "It is a claim." Jonah looked at her. "Is that bad?" For one brief moment, the corner of her mouth moved like she almost remembered how to smile. For them, yes. The blue light widened, reaching from Jonah's shackles to the silver chains around Mara's wrists. The auction hall erupted in whispers as ancient letters burned across the floor. The ledger wrote Jonah's name in ink the color of moonlight, and beside it appeared words no one in the room wanted spoken aloud. Prisoner's claim recognized. The lowest hand has challenged the highest sale. The words burned across the floor in moonlit blue, and the Black Meridian auction reacted as if Jonah Reed had set loose something older than fear. Prisoner's claim recognized. The lowest hand has challenged the highest sale. For 3 seconds, no one spoke. Jonah stayed on his knees with his shackled hands still raised, breathing hard, not because the iron hurt, but because every masked face in the hall now looked at him like he had become a legal disaster in a prison shirt. The old smuggler beside him pressed his forehead to the stone. You just made yourself visible to every court that hates being reminded it has rules. Jonah kept his eyes on Mara Vane. The blue light had reached her silver restraints and settled over them like frost under moonlight. The chains did not break. They did not even loosen. But the guards around her stepped back as if the metal had stopped belonging to them. The auctioneer stared at the ledger, his elegant composure collapsing 1 careful inch at a time. This cannot proceed, he said. The claimant is convicted property. The ledger answered before any person could. Conviction under review upon prisoner's stake. Sale suspended pending worth of sentence. Lord Cashin Rook moved faster than his calm had suggested he could, though still with the dignity of a man who believed anger should be worn like a tailored coat. The court does not review mortal convictions in an auction hall. Mara's crimson gaze cut to him. It does when that conviction is used as currency. The room turned toward her, shocked less by her words than by the steadiness in them. She stood inside the iron frame, pale and bound, her dark hunter's coat torn at one shoulder, her long black hair falling over the silver collar at her throat, yet the space around her felt suddenly less like a cage and more like disputed territory. Jonah realized then that everyone had called her a huntress as if it meant weapon, monster, danger. But the way Rook looked at her made the truth colder. He was not afraid of what she might do. He was afraid of what she knew. The blue light widened again, connecting Jonah, Mara, the auctioneer's ledger, and the sealed evidence table beside the stage. A compartment beneath the table opened by itself. Inside lay a black flight recorder, its casing scratched but intact, marked with the emblem of the prison convoy company that had transported Jonah's doomed rescue flight. Jonah's breath left him. That is from my aircraft. Rook's jaw tightened. Irrelevant salvage. Mara's chains rang softly as she turned toward the evidence. No, that is why I was hunting your route. Jonah looked up at her. What? Her voice lowered, but the hall carried every syllable. The crash that imprisoned you was not an accident. Your aircraft was carrying a sealed prisoner transfer hidden under a civilian medical charter. I tracked the route because 3 vampire witnesses had disappeared the same way. You diverted the aircraft to save passengers before the convoy could reach Black Meridian airspace. Jonah felt the floor tilt beneath him. For 6 months, the official story had been a clean, simple knife, reckless pilot, unauthorized maneuver, 1 lost passenger, criminal negligence. He had learned to sleep beside that accusation. He had learned to answer to it. Now the woman in chains was telling him the truth had been buried in the same place as her freedom. The auctioneer snapped the ledger shut, but it opened again on its own. The black flight recorder rose from the compartment, surrounded by blue fire, and played a preserved audio memory into the hall. Not screams, not violence, just Jonah's own voice from the cockpit, strained but clear, calling coordinates, ordering emergency brace positions, refusing a command from an unknown voice to continue into restricted airspace. Then another voice answered over the radio, smooth and unmistakable. Rook's voice. Maintain course. Cargo priority outranks passenger risk. A shock moved through the hall. Jonah stared at Rook. The noble's face had gone perfectly blank. Mara looked at Jonah, and for the first time her expression held no challenge, only grim confirmation. You were convicted because saving them exposed the route. Jonah's raised hand slowly lowered into his lap. Not in surrender, in realization. And you were chained because you found the recorder. Mara nodded once. I found it. I was bringing it to the bloodrit when Rook declared me rogue. The blue letters on the floor shifted. Claim expanded. Mutual false classification identified. The old smuggler beside Jonah let out a shaky laugh. Lowest hand, highest sale, and now the same lie holding both chains. That is poetry with teeth. Rook turned toward the guards. Remove the recorder. None of them moved. The auctioneer whispered, "My lord, the claim has linked the evidence." "Then unlink it." Mara smiled without warmth. "You should have let the prisoner breathe quietly." Jonah looked at the flight recorder, then at his shackles, then at the huntress who had been dragged into the hall as a final lot because she had tried to clear a man she had never met. The guilt he had carried for months did not vanish, but it changed shape. It was no longer a grave. It was a door. The ledger wrote a new line in moonlit ink. Bloodrit court summoned. Claimants will stand together or fall separately. Mara's eyes found Jonah's across the blue-lit floor. "You wanted to bid with your sentence," she said. "Now the court will ask whether you are willing to risk the truth that could free you." Jonah felt the weight of 14 stolen years, the shame sewn into his prison number, the memory of passengers walking away because he had disobeyed the wrong order. Then he raised both shackled hands just enough for the court to see. "I already risked my life once to get people out of a doomed flight," he said. "I can risk my reputation to get us both out of a lie." The floor beneath them opened into a descending circle of blue fire, and the auction hall watched in horrified silence as the prisoner and the chained huntress were called below together. The descent into the blood-rit court felt nothing like leaving the auction hall and everything like being swallowed by the truth. Jonah Reed stood on a circular platform of blue fire as it lowered through black stone, his shackles still locked, his prison shirt marked with the number that had replaced his name, and Mara Vane standing across from him with silver chains gathered around her wrists and throat like the last argument of a losing enemy. Above them, the Black Meridian auction remained frozen in shocked silence, but not distant enough to escape. Every bidder, guard, noble, and prisoner could see the platform falling through the open floor, could see the flight recorder hovering between Jonah and Mara like a black box full of buried weather. Lord Cashin Rook descended on a separate stairway with the auctioneer and 6 silent guards behind him, his face calm again, though the calm had become thinner, polished over something sharp. "You understand what happens next," Mara said without looking away from Rook. Jonah flexed his wrists against the cold iron. "A vampire court clears my name, and everyone apologizes? No, I was afraid of that. The court will test whether your sentence still owns you." Jonah looked at her then. Blue fire lit the planes of her face, turning her crimson eyes darker, sadder, less like a monster from prison rumors, and more like someone who had spent too long being useful to people who feared gratitude. "And what does it test for you?" "Whether I am still a huntress," she said, "or merely the weapon Rook named me." The platform stopped in a chamber so wide Jonah could not see the far wall, only rings of stone seats rising into darkness and 7 hanging lanterns burning with blue-white flame. At the center stood 2 empty witness circles. One was marked with prison sigils, the other with the crescent and arrow crest of the nocturne writ. The flight recorder floated between them and opened without hands. A voice emerged from the court itself, ancient and layered. "Prisoner's claim admitted. Linked false classification identified. Jonah Reed, convicted mortal. Mara Vane, stripped huntress. Stand and witness or withdraw." Rook stepped onto the court floor before either of them could answer. Withdraw is the only lawful option. The prisoner lacked standing. The huntress was stripped by emergency authority. "I request dismissal." The blue lanterns dimmed. The court answered, "Request denied." A ripple moved through the chamber above. The auction audience had been pulled into the viewing tiers, forced to watch from behind a transparent wall of blue flame. Jonah saw the old smuggler, still kneeling, eyes wide with the terrible delight of a man witnessing impossible paperwork become dangerous. The court voice spoke again. "Jonah Reed, you offered the remaining years of your sentence as stake." "State what?" Jonah swallowed. He could feel Rook watching him, waiting for anger, confusion, anything that could be named instability. He forced himself to speak plainly. "Because nobody else would raise a hand. Because they were going to sell her and call it law. Because I know what it is like to be renamed by a report written to protect powerful people." The prison sigils under his feet glowed. "Do you claim Mara Vane as property?" "No." "As payment?" "No." as absolution for your own guilt. The question hit harder. Jonah looked down at his shackles. The faces from the crash still lived in him, not accusing, just present. Maybe at first, he said, and several nobles stirred. Rook's mouth curved. Jonah kept going. I saw her chains and thought about mine. I thought if I helped her, maybe it would prove I was still a rescuer and not just the number they gave me. But that is not enough. She does not exist to fix what happened to me. The blue light steadied. Mara's expression changed, not soft exactly, but attentive in a way that made the room feel quieter. Jonah raised his eyes. I keep the claim because the evidence says we were both buried by the same lie. If my sentence can buy her a hearing, then let the court weigh it. But I do not own her. I am standing beside her. The prison sigils loosened from the floor and rose around his shackles, not breaking them, but turning the cold iron warm. The court voice shifted. Intent recorded. Mara stepped into the second circle before anyone asked. I was huntress of the Nocturne writ, she said. My oath was to track threats hidden behind noble seals. I found Rook's convoy route. I found living witnesses moved as cargo. I found Jonah Reed's flight recorder after his conviction. For that, I was declared rogue, chained, and offered for sale to erase the question I carried. Rook laughed once, low and controlled. You were stripped because you pursued private vengeance and violated restricted territory. Mara turned her head toward him. Then show the order that sent me there. The court waited. Rook did not move. The flight recorder spun slowly in the air. The ledger beside it opened to a page bearing Rook's seal. The order appeared, dated 3 weeks before Mara's hunt, authorizing her to investigate disappearances along the convoy route. Gasps rose from the viewing tiers. The auctioneer looked suddenly ill. The court voice spoke with terrible calm. Emergency stripping contradicted by prior command. Accuser concealed authorization. The chains around Mara's wrists loosened another inch. Rook's eyes flashed, but he recovered. A technical inconsistency. Nothing more. Jonah looked at him through the blue fire and felt his fear become useful. That is what they call my flight recorder too. The court lanterns brightened, and the black box projected its final preserved file into the chamber. The missing command log, the deleted route, the cargo manifest with prisoner names hidden under medical codes, and the order bearing Cashin Rook's signature to maintain course despite passenger risk. No one screamed. No one needed to. The public silence was worse. Mara lifted her bound hands, the silver chains sliding down as if ashamed to hold her. The huntress asks judgment, she said. The court answered. Judgment requires final claimant choice. Jonah Reed may withdraw, reclaim independent review of his conviction, and leave Mara Vane to separate trial. Or he may bind his sentence to joint verdict. Mara turned sharply. Jonah, do not give them 14 years. Are you telling me to save myself? I am telling you I have survived courts longer than your country has had highways. That was not an answer. For the first time, Mara looked away. Yes, save yourself if you can. Jonah looked at the viewing tiers, at prisoners watching from behind guards, at bidders who had been comfortable until a man with nothing raised his hand, at the flight recorder that could free him if he let the court separate their cases. Then he looked at Mara, proud, furious, and alone by habit. I was a rescue pilot, he said. Separate trial sounds like leaving someone behind. He lifted his shackled hands into the blue light. Joint verdict. The prison sigils and huntress crest flared together, and high above them, every weapon in the auction guard line lowered without command. The joint verdict did not make the blood-writ court louder. It made it deeper. The blue fire around Jonah Reed's shackles and Mara Vane's huntress crest braided together into a single ring, not binding their bodies, not forcing their hearts, but linking their cases so the court could no longer free one truth while burying the other. Above them, the viewing tiers of the Black Meridian auction remained trapped behind transparent flame, every bidder and guard forced to witness what they had expected to purchase in private. Jonah felt the warmth around his wrists spread through the iron until the shackles no longer felt like ownership. They felt like evidence waiting to be corrected. Mara stood beside him, still pale, still chained, still dangerous in that silent way that made powerful people careful with their breathing. But something had changed after Jonah chose joint verdict. She no longer stood angled away from him, as if protecting him from association. She stood at his side, shoulder aligned with his, eyes on the court, accepting that his decision was not ignorance. It was agency. The ancient voice filled the chamber. Joint verdict accepted. Evidence will be weighed as one chain of false classification. Accuser Cashin Rook may answer the linked record. Lord Rook stepped into the center with his silver half-mask in one hand, his face composed enough to be insulting. Then I answer plainly. The prisoner's conviction was mortal jurisdiction. The huntress stripping was writ jurisdiction. Linking them is sentimental contamination. A human pilot's guilt and a rogue tracker's obsession do not invalidate security needs along restricted routes. The court ledger opened wider. A blue-white image rose above it. The convoy flight path, the hidden cargo codes, the passenger manifest, and the order that had redirected Jonah's aircraft toward Black Meridian airspace. Jonah watched the route lines intersect like veins of a machine built to move people without names. Rook continued. Those routes prevented broader panic. They contained dangerous transfers. They protected both human and vampire populations from information they were not equipped to understand. Mara's voice came cold and clear. You mean they protected your buyers from witnesses? The ledger turned. Names appeared in the air, not numbers this time. Names. Human medics. Vampire defectors. Border informants. Civilians who had vanished inside administrative language. The viewing tiers went silent in a different way, no longer fascinated, no longer afraid, but implicated. The old smuggler in the prisoner row bowed his head. One masked bidder removed her mask entirely, as if the cloth had become too heavy. Jonah stared at the names and saw the shape of his own case among them. Not an isolated tragedy. A system. My crash was supposed to hide one route, he said. No, Mara answered softly. It was supposed to prove no one could survive challenging it. Rook turned on her. You always needed enemies, Mara. A huntress without a monster becomes one. For the first time, the words found a visible wound. Her face did not crumble, but Jonah saw the tiny pause before she answered. The exhaustion of someone who had spent years being called wild by the very people who sent her into darkness. I hunted what the writ commanded me to hunt, and when the writ commanded silence. Rook asked. I hunted that too. The blue fire flared. The court voice spoke. Huntress oath verified. Rogue designation unsupported. The silver collar at Mara's throat cracked down the center. No violence, no spectacle, just a clean line opening in false authority. A murmur rose through the tiers. Jonah turned toward her, but she kept her gaze forward, refusing to let relief become weakness before the people who had paid to see her lowered. The court continued. Jonah Reed. Conviction review will proceed under linked evidence. The missing flight recorder confirms refusal of unlawful routing and preservation of passenger life. Criminal negligence unsupported. Jonah closed his eyes. The words should have freed him instantly. Instead, they hurt. 6 months of iron bunks, numbered clothing, letters unanswered because he had been too ashamed to write, memories of his own name spoken like a charge. The truth did not give that time back. It only stopped the lie from taking more. When he opened his eyes, Mara was looking at him, and something in her expression made the court disappear for half a breath. Respect, yes. Gratitude, maybe. But more than that, a recognition between two people who had both been renamed and had refused to become the names. Rook saw the verdict turning and made one final attempt to own the room. If you clear them, you expose every court that signed transfer authority. You expose mortal agencies, prison contractors, writ officials, and half the bidders above us. You think this ends with justice? It ends with war between systems that require silence to function. Jonah looked up at the viewing tiers. Maybe systems that require silence should be afraid. The old smuggler laughed once, shaky and bright, before clapping a hand over his mouth. But the sound had already done its work. A few prisoners lifted their heads. A guard in the auction line lowered his weapon completely. Then another. Then a third. Public fear began turning into public distance from Rook, and for a man like him, that was the first real punishment. The court voice delivered judgment with no anger at all. Cashin Rook is stripped of convoy authority, writ command, and noble witness privilege pending full tribunal. Black Meridian auction rights are suspended. Prisoner sales under false classification are void. Affected mortal convictions are opened for review. Mara Vane is restored as huntress of the Nocturne writ. Jonah Reed is released from criminal sentence under court-recognized false conviction. The iron around Jonah's wrists opened, and fell to the floor. Mara's collar followed a second later. Neither of them moved at first. Freedom arrived too quietly to trust. Then Mara bent, picked up Jonah's fallen shackles, and placed them beside her broken collar in the witness circle. "Let the court keep both," she said, "so no one forgets what polite lies can hold." The blue fire accepted them, sealing the iron and silver into the floor as permanent record. Jonah rubbed his wrists, feeling skin where weight used to be. The court voice returned, softer but no less absolute. Joint claim resolved. Both parties may separate without debt. No bond remains unless freely renewed by oath. Mara turned to Jonah in front of every noble, guard, prisoner, and bidder who had watched them stand together. "You are free to leave," she said. "This time, no one may order you to stay." Jonah looked toward the stairs leading back up to the Nevada desert, to a world where his name had just been returned, but his life had no shape yet. Then he looked at the prisoners in the viewing tier, some still chained, some staring at him like a door had opened in a wall they had mistaken for the sky. "I will leave," he said, "after the next case is opened." Mara's crimson eyes warmed with the smallest, fiercest smile. "Then I stand with you as witness." Above them, the auction hall bowed into stunned silence, and the blood-red court opened its ledger to the first of many stolen names. The first stolen name belonged to a girl Jonah Reed had seen only once in the prison convoy yard. A teenager with silver eyes and a blanket around her shoulders, listed in the system as medical cargo despite the fact that she had asked a guard for water in perfect English. Her name rose from the blood-writ ledger in blue fire. Elise Marrow, border witness, false transfer pending. The viewing tiers above the court shifted uneasily. The auction was over, but the room had not been allowed to leave, and that was the first mercy the court gave back to the powerless. It made the comfortable stay. Jonah stood beside Mara Vane with the weight of his shackles gone from his wrists and somehow still present in his bones. Freedom felt strange when so many others remained on the wrong side of a locked process. The court voice filled the chamber. Released claimant Jonah Reed may depart. Further witness action is voluntary. Every face turned toward him again, but this time the room did not look at him as property. It looked at him as precedent. Mara glanced sideways at him. "This is the door you asked to open. You do not have to walk through every room behind it." Jonah looked up at the prisoner row suspended behind blue flame, at men and women and others whose faces had changed when his sentence fell away. Hope was dangerous in a place like Black Meridian. It made people visible. "When I was flying rescue routes," he said, "the hardest part was never finding the crash site. It was deciding who to lift first when everyone needed out." Mara's expression tightened with understanding. "And what did you do?" "I started with the person the structure was about to bury." The ledger turned a page. Elise Marrow's record unfolded into clean, harmless words. Escorted transfer, clinical review, private evaluation. Then the evidence light corrected them. A quiet image appeared above the court floor, showing the girl seated in a transport room, signing a statement about convoy routes before the document was sealed and her name converted into cargo code. No graphic detail. No spectacle. Just a living person reduced to a category. The old smuggler in the tier whispered, "I saw her. They moved her after midnight." A guard beside him looked away. Mara stepped forward. "The huntress of the Nocturne writ requests expansion of review to all prisoners brought through Black Meridian under false classification." A violent murmur rose from the nobles, but the court flames swallowed it into silence. Rook, stripped of authority but not yet removed, lifted his head from the far side of the chamber. "You will collapse half the Western transfer system." Mara faced him. "No, we will find out what it was carrying." Jonah stepped beside her, and the gold-blue remnant of the prisoner claim flickered around his bare wrists. "Put me on record as witness." The court voice answered. "Jonah Reed, false conviction survivor, may serve as mortal witness if freely sworn." Mara turned sharply. "Jonah, a witness seat is not ceremonial. It means threats, hearings, public testimony, enemies with better lawyers than courage." He gave her a tired look. "I have had enemies with lawyers. Courage would be a nice change." For the second time since the auction began, Mara almost smiled. Then she addressed the court, and her voice carried to the highest tier. "Let it be recorded that the human is not mine, not bound, not purchased, and not claimed by debt. If he swears, he does so under his own name. That mattered. Jonah saw it in the way the elders reacted, in the way the prisoners straightened, in the way the guards who had lowered their weapons kept them lowered. Mara was not using him as proof of her restoration. She was protecting the freedom he had only just regained. The court waited. Jonah remembered the crash board calling him reckless. He remembered Rook's voice ordering him to maintain course. He remembered Mara in chains telling him to save himself. Then he lifted his right hand, not shackled now, open and steady. I swear as mortal witness to the blood-writ review. I will speak for those classified into silence. I will not own the huntress, and I will not be owned by the court. I stand because I choose to. The blue fire accepted the words. A mark appeared on his wrist, not iron, not a chain, but a thin line of pale light shaped like an open wing. The court voice spoke. Mortal witness recognized. Review expanded. False transfers under Black Meridian are suspended. Living prisoners are removed from sale authority and placed under court protection pending name restoration. The reaction above them was not a cheer. It was better. It was the sound of weapons being set down, keys being removed from belts, ledgers being opened, masks being taken off. Guards began unlocking the prisoner row under the court's blue flame, not all at once, not dramatically, but steadily, one name at a time. Elise Marrow was the first brought down. She stood small and shaking in the witness circle, looked at Jonah's prison shirt, then at Mara's restored crest, and whispered, "Does this mean we are people again?" Mara knelt to meet her eyes, not as a predator, not as a weapon, but as the guardian the court had tried to bury. "You never stopped being people," she said. "They only stopped writing it down." Jonah looked away for a second because the words hit harder than he expected. In the viewing tier, the old smuggler wiped his face with both hands and pretended he had not. The ledger turned again, revealing more names waiting. Rook watched from the edge of the flame, stripped of command, finally forced to witness the undoing of his system by the two people he had mislabeled the most. Mara rose beside Jonah. "This will take until sunrise." Jonah looked at the open ledger, the lowered weapons, the prisoners stepping one by one from numbers back into names. "Then I guess we work until sunrise." Above the court, the sealed ceiling opened to the Nevada sky, still dark but beginning to pale at the eastern edge. Blue court fire mixed with the first thin promise of dawn, and for the first time since Jonah had entered Black Meridian in chains, the air smelled less like stone and fear, and more like a way out. By the time the eastern sky began to pale over the Nevada desert, the blood-writ ledger had spoken 43 stolen names back into the world. Jonah Reed stood near the witness circle with his prison shirt still on, the number across his chest no longer legally valid but not yet physically removed, and the pale open wing mark glowing on his wrist whenever another false record corrected itself. Mara Vane moved through the court with the terrifying calm of someone born for impossible rooms. Her chains were gone. Her silver collar was sealed into the floor beside Jonah's old shackles, but the marks they had left on her throat and wrists remained faintly visible under the blue fire. She did not hide them. Every time a prisoner stepped forward, every time a guard unlocked another restraint, every time a noble tried to object and found the court flame rising between them and the witness floor, Mara stood where the frightened could see her. Not above them, not behind a throne, beside the ledger. A huntress restored, using her power to make records tell the truth. Elise Marrow sat wrapped in a gray coat near the first row of freed witnesses, drinking water with both hands around the cup, like she was afraid it might be taken back. The old smuggler with silver tattoos had given his real name, August Bell, and then looked offended when the court believed him. 2 convoy guards had surrendered their keys and asked to testify before anyone asked them to. Every new name changed the room. The auction guests who had arrived to buy secrets now stood exposed beneath them. Some tried to leave. The doors did not open. Some tried to bargain. The ledger ignored them. Some lowered their masks and stared at the floor as if shame were a language they were only beginning to learn. Jonah watched a boy from the prisoner row hear his own name restored and nearly collapse from relief. Mara caught him by the shoulder before he fell, steady and silent. The boy looked at her crimson eyes and did not flinch. That, more than any verdict, made the court shift. Mara felt it too. Jonah could see it in the way her face changed by one careful degree, as if she had been prepared for fear and did not know what to do with trust. The ancient voice spoke again. Primary. Black Meridian review complete. False transfer network confirmed. Convoy authority dissolved. Prisoner sale permissions voided across western routes. A sound rose from the freed witnesses. Not applause, not celebration, but a collective breath leaving bodies that had held it too long. Then the court turned its light on Jonah. Mortal witness, Jonah Reed. Your conviction remains overturned. Your sentence is erased. Compensation and public correction are ordered through mortal liaison. You may depart under full protection. The doors to the desert opened. Cold dawn air entered the chamber, carrying dust, sagebrush, and the distant sound of highway traffic. Jonah looked at the opening and felt his whole body lean toward it. 6 months of prison. 6 months of being told he was guilty. 6 months of dreaming about sky and waking to concrete. Freedom stood less than 100 feet away, and for a moment he wanted nothing more than to walk through it alone, without courts, vampires, witnesses, or anyone needing him. Mara did not ask him to stay. That was what nearly made him. She only turned toward the open doors and said, "You earned that road." Jonah studied her profile in the blue fire, the restored huntress crest at her collar, the exhaustion beneath her control. "What about you?" "I returned to the Nocturne writ," she said. "I answer for every year I failed to uncover the full network." Failed? Jonah looked back at the 43 people alive, named, and protected because of her evidence. "That is what you call this?" Her mouth tightened. "A huntress counts the ones she did not find." Jonah knew that tone. Rescue pilots had it. Firefighters had it. Medics had it. Anyone who had saved 12 and remembered the 13th. He stepped closer, keeping his voice low enough that the court would not turn it into performance. "Mara, you were chained and still dragged the truth into the room." Her eyes moved to his. "And you were imprisoned and still raised your hand." The words sat between them, quiet and dangerous because they were not gratitude anymore. They were recognition. The court flame softened, almost politely. Mara looked away first, then faced the witnesses. "Hear me," she said, and the chamber stilled. No restored prisoner leaves Black Meridian without escort, documentation, and name protection. No witness is returned to a system that classified them falsely. The writ failed them once. It will not do so again while I hold the hunt. An elder vampire rose slowly from the upper tier. "You claim authority beyond your reinstatement." Mara lifted her chin. "Yes." A shocked murmur spread. The elder's eyes narrowed. "On what grounds?" Mara turned toward Jonah, not asking permission, not using him, but making the cost public. "On the grounds that a human prisoner had to remind this court that law without mercy becomes a marketplace. I accept the disgrace of that lesson before the writ. I also accept the duty it creates." The elder lowered his gaze. One by one, the Nocturne guards bowed their heads. Public recognition moved through the chamber like sunrise touching stone. Jonah felt the open wing mark on his wrist glow once. The court voice answered. Huntress authority expanded. Witness protection mandate established. Mortal liaison seat remains available to Jonah Reed by free choice, not debt. Mara looked at him then. "Free choice," she repeated softly. "Do not waste it because the room is watching." Jonah looked at the desert road again, then at the freed witnesses, then at the black flight recorder, sealed beside the broken chains, proof that one raised hand had forced a hidden system into daylight. He smiled tiredly. "I used to fly people out of places like this." Mara's expression warmed by the smallest fraction. "There are still people who need routes out." Jonah stepped away from the open door and back toward the witness circle. "Then I am not done with rescue work." The court recorded the choice in blue fire, and above them the last stars faded from the Nevada sky. The final review of Black Meridian did not end in the underground chamber. It rose. At sunrise, the blood-writ court carried its witnesses up through the open floor of the auction hall, past the frozen rows where bidders had once sat behind velvet masks, and into the wide desert air above the prison convoy route. Jonah Reed stepped out first, because the court ordered the freed mortal witness to be seen before the nobles. He still wore the prison shirt, but the number on his chest had burned away into a clean patch of pale fabric, leaving his name written in blue light over his heart for every camera, guard, lawyer, and court official to read. Jonah Reed, cleared witness, mortal liaison by free choice. The words embarrassed him more than the prison number ever had. But Mara Vane walked beside him with the calm of a storm that had learned patience, and somehow that made the eyes easier to bear. The desert stretched around them in red stone and cold gold dawn, convoy fences cutting across the sand, black transport vehicles lined up in rows, and beyond them, a cluster of freed prisoners wrapped in gray coats, while clerks restored names to their files. The Black Meridian facility looked smaller in daylight. Things built on secrecy usually did. Lord Cashin Rook stood before the outer gate under court guard, stripped of his silver mask, his noble witness privilege revoked, his convoy authority dissolved. He no longer looked untouchable. He looked like a man waiting to discover whether people feared him or merely feared the system that had carried his name. The answer came when his own guards lowered their weapons and stepped away. The ancient court voice rolled across the desert. Public judgment will be entered into mortal and writ record. False convictions tied to Black Meridian routes are suspended for review. Living transfer markets are abolished under nocturne jurisdiction. Witness names are restored. Prisoner sales under private auction authority are void. A murmur moved through the freed prisoners. Some cried quietly. Some stared at their hands, as if expecting chains to return. Elise Marrow stood near Jonah, clutching her restored identification papers, looking at the open road with the frightened concentration of someone learning that leaving was allowed. Mara stepped forward, and the nocturne guards straightened. For years, they had known her as a huntress, then a rogue, then a lot number in an auction ledger. Now they watched her stand before the convoy gate with no collar, no chains, and no one else speaking for her. "I accept restoration as huntress of the nocturne writ," she said, her voice carrying into the pale morning. "But restoration without change is only decoration for the same cage. My first action is to create sanctuary passage for every witness recovered from Black Meridian. No convoy, clan, prison contractor, or noble house may reclaim them without public hearing. Any future prisoner classification involving living testimony must include mortal review." The elders in the court line reacted sharply. One of them, a tall vampire in a black formal coat, stepped forward. "You give mortals authority inside writ proceedings?" Mara turned her crimson eyes on him. "No. I return authority to the people your proceedings kept misnaming." The silence that followed was public, uncomfortable, and necessary. Then Mara looked at Jonah. Jonah Reed is offered the mortal liaison seat because he raised his hand when doing so could not profit him, because he joined his verdict to mine when separation would have freed him faster, and because a system that can imprison a rescuer for refusing an unlawful route needs a rescuer in the room when routes are drawn. The court voice answered, "Seat recognized if freely accepted." Every witness turned to Jonah again. He hated that part. He had never wanted a title. He had wanted an appeal, a clean record, maybe one quiet apartment with a ceiling fan and no locks on the door. The open desert road was still there. The court had promised he could take it. Mara had promised the same. Nothing on his wrist pulled him forward. The open wing mark glowed softly, waiting without demand. Jonah looked at the convoy vehicles, then at the people who had nearly been reduced to cargo, then at Rook standing alone at the gate. "I accept," he said. "Not forever, because no oath should pretend a person never changes. I accept for as long as my voice helps keep these doors open." The court flame brightened. Term accepted. Free oath recorded. Mara's expression changed in a way only Jonah seemed close enough to notice. Not relief exactly. Respect, edged with something warmer and more dangerous because it had room to grow without needing a name yet. She turned back to the assembled court. "Then let this be the new law of Black Meridian. No one breathes in our custody without a name. No one stands trial without access to the record against them. No one is sold because silence makes paperwork convenient." One by one, the nocturne guards lowered their blades into the sand. The vampire elders bowed their heads, some willingly, some because the court flame left them nowhere else to look. Human officials opened their folders and began signing emergency reversals. The freed witnesses watched as the auction banners were pulled down from the facility walls and replaced with plain white markers bearing names, not lot numbers. Jonah saw his own shackles and Mara's broken collar sealed inside a glass evidence pillar at the gate, not hidden, not polished, preserved as proof. Mara came to stand beside him as the sun cleared the horizon. "You can still leave after the first transport departs," she said quietly. Jonah watched Elise Marrow board a civilian bus under court protection, her restored papers held against her chest like a shield. I know. And he looked at the road, then at the sky, huge and blue over the desert. For the first time in months, it did not look far away. It looked reachable, and I think I want to see where the route goes. Mara's mouth curved slightly. That sounds dangerously like hope. Jonah gave her a tired smile. I am told I make reckless flight decisions. This time, Mara did smile, small, real, and witnessed by the dawn. Behind them, the last weapon lowered, the final auction door was sealed by the court, and the convoy gate opened toward the highway. Jonah and Mara stood side by side as the first protected transport rolled into sunlight, carrying names the world would no longer be allowed to forget. By full sunrise, Black Meridian no longer looked like an auction house. It looked like a crime scene being turned into a courthouse in front of everyone who had paid to pretend it was neither. The red velvet banners were gone from the walls, the private bidder doors were sealed in blue court fire, and the names restored from the ledger hung above the desert gate in pale light. One after another, no longer numbers, cargo codes, or lots. Jonah Reed stood beside Mara Vane at the center of the convoy yard, the open wing mark on his wrist glowing softly, his old prison shirt clean where the number had burned away. Around them stood the freed witnesses, the lowered nocturne guards, mortal officials recording emergency reversals, vampire elders who had been forced to watch the system they tolerated become visible, and Lord Cashin Rook, stripped of mask, title, convoy authority, and noble witness privilege. Rook's final judgment was read without ceremony. His transfer network was dissolved, his private contracts were voided, his assets were redirected to compensate those falsely imprisoned or classified, and every conviction tied to his hidden routes was reopened under joint mortal and writ review. The auctioneer lost license, standing, and protection. The guards who testified were spared punishment only if they remained to identify every sealed route. The bidders who had attempted to buy prisoners were recorded publicly, their houses notified, their privileges suspended until review. No one had to ask what happened next. The machinery that had buried Jonah and chained Mara had been named, opened, and broken in front of the people it had relied on intimidating. The court then turned to the claim itself, because old laws always demanded clean endings. The ancient voice rose from the blue fire. Prisoner's claim was not ownership, marriage, blood bond, or servitude. It was an emergency witness law. When a prisoner with no property offered the remaining weight of his sentence to stop the unlawful sale of a falsely classified person, the court was required to review both chains. The claim has served its purpose. No debt remains between Jonah Reed and Mara Vane. The open wing mark on Jonah's wrist dimmed until it became only a thin gold line, light as breath. For the first time since he raised his hand, nothing held him in place. The gate to the highway stood open. A civilian transport waited beyond it with his name cleared, a liaison ready to drive him anywhere in the country, and a court order guaranteeing protection, compensation, and a public apology from the agencies that had helped convict him. Mara saw him looking. She stepped forward before the court, not as the chained huntress from the auction stage, but as the restored huntress of the nocturne writ, her dark coat repaired at the shoulders, the crescent and arrow crest bright at her collar, the marks from her former chains still visible because she had chosen not to hide them. Jonah Reed owes me nothing, she said, her voice carrying across guards, elders, officials, and freed witnesses. He did not save me because I was harmless. He did not raise his hand because he understood our law. He saw a person being sold and refused to let silence be the only witness. I will not repay that refusal by making a cage out of gratitude. She turned toward the elders. But I choose him publicly as mortal witness to my restored hunt, if he chooses the seat freely. I also accept the cost before the writ. Every hunt I lead from this day forward will include mortal review when mortal lives are named in our records. If my clan calls that weakness, let them say it with the freed standing here. The public shock was quiet but unmistakable. One nocturne guard lowered his blade. Then another. Then every guard in the yard lowered theirs point first into the sand. The vampire elders bowed their heads, some with shame, some with anger they did not dare speak, all with recognition. Elise Marrow stepped from the line of freed witnesses and placed her restored papers against her heart. August Bell, the old smuggler, gave Jonah a crooked salute with shaking fingers. Mortal officials signed the new mandate into joint record. Jonah Reed, cleared rescue pilot. Mortal liaison and oath-bearer of sanctuary passage, free to depart, free to return, answerable to no owner, court, or huntress. Mara faced Jonah then, and for once the danger in her crimson eyes did not hide the gentleness beneath it. "You wanted a way out," she said softly. "There it is." Jonah looked past the gate to the highway, to sunlight on asphalt, to a world where his name had been returned. He imagined taking the transport, sleeping in a motel with no bars on the window, calling the families from the flight and telling them the truth was finally public. He could do all of that. No law would stop him. No bond would pull him back. That was why the choice mattered. He looked down at the gold line on his wrist, then at the broken shackles and silver collar sealed inside the glass evidence pillar beside the gate. "I spent 6 months being told I was reckless because I did not follow an order that would have left people trapped," he said. "Last night, I raised my hand for the same reason. Not because I knew the law, because I knew the room was wrong." He stepped beside Mara, not behind her, not in front of her, but beside her where the court could see the distance between choice and possession. "I accept the witness seat. I will help open every route Black Meridian closed. And when this work is done, if I leave as a free man. If I return the same way." The court flame turned gold along the desert sand. "Free oath recorded." Mara inclined her head to him, solemn as a vow and proud as sunrise. Then the nocturne writ recognizes Jonah Reed as oath-bearer of sanctuary passage. Behind them, the final auction door cracked, folded inward, and sealed into smooth stone, erased from use but not from memory. The freed witnesses boarded protected transports under open sky. The guards remained with blades lowered until the last name had crossed the gate. As the sun climbed over the Nevada desert, Jonah and Mara walked toward the highway side by side. The huntress no longer chained, the prisoner no longer numbered, the old law no longer a trap but a bridge. In the glass pillar behind them, iron and silver caught the dawn together, proof that one raised hand in a silent room had changed the route for everyone who came after.